Hey, welcome back to the pod. This will be the week 6 recap and the week 7 preview. As always, we will recap a few games that we previewed last week and go over some winners and losers for the week, some bets that we made, and then preview next week's game. So just get right into it. First game that I believe we previewed last week was LSU, Florida.
I'm going to get Tolman on right now.
Yeah, it's fine. Just get
He's ready to go.
He's ready to go? All right. Actually, we need him for that game.
Yep.
So, yeah, we'll see if he gets on the line here.
Hello. How's it going? We just started. We're getting right into the games from this past weekend. So we're going to talk about LSU, Florida first.
Sure. Would you like me to chime in on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I watched the game, and I didn't realize this until doing a little bit of research just right before the game. But Florida's defensive ends are really good.
Yeah.
And overall their defensive line's good, but their defensive ends are great. And LSU, their plays just take so long to develop. So Burrow was constantly under pressure. Finally showed up in the end. He got flustered, threw a pick to end the game, and Florida's defensive pressure that took over.
Yeah, I think when Addison and I and yourself, when we previewed that game, we said, like we've been saying on this pod for a long time, that LSU was an overrated team compared to, like they were ranked 5th in the nation, but we knew they weren't a top 5 team. And there was some, I guess, like we were kind of split amongst the group on how we felt about their game, but what we did know is we just felt like LSU was closer to where Florida was ranked than what Florida, compared to like LSU or whatever. And like we've said for the first quarter or almost half of the season now, is LSU just lacks the playmakers that they've had in the past. And the thing that's kind of kept them afloat is they've had good matchups, as you alluded to last week, and Joey Burrow hadn't turned the ball over, and then this was finally the week that LSU was -3 in the turnover margin, and that's pretty much what I felt like decided the game. I felt like it was a pretty evenly played game. Yards per play were pretty similar, total yards overall. I felt like, obviously, Burrow's pick 6 was the backbreaker, but I felt like it was an evenly played game, and LSU showed their true colors. I think they're probably somewhere around 20th, 15th to 20th ranked, something like that.
Yeah, solid team. I didn't think they should have been 5th.
Right.
I mean, I thought going in that both these teams were pretty even. So with it being in the swamp, I gave the nod to Florida. Another thing about Florida's D is they've caused a lot of turnovers this year.
Yeah. And
that ended up being a huge factor in yesterday's game, obviously, the turnovers. LSU's team, I feel like, the way they play, they're going to try and play good defense and try to play mistake-free on offense, and that usually gives them enough. So it's hard for them to win games if they're turning it over like that. And like you said, Joe Burrow had done a good job of that so far this year, and then yesterday, he had a few, especially the one at the end of the game pretty much sealed it. So
the turnovers definitely were a problem, but look for this problem for LSU to have for the rest of the year, and it goes back to the fact that they don't have the playmakers. No one was getting separation, and when they start running into those teams with defensive lines as good or even better than Florida, I think they're going to continue to have problems offensively.
Yeah, we're gonna actually we actually have to preview them again this week when they play Georgia at home. So we'll get into that later in the pod. But Steele, did you have anything to add from that game? Or we cover that pretty well?
No, that's pretty much it. When I was picking the game and I was leaning LSU, it was based on the fact that I thought you could get more out of Burrow than you would get out of Felipe Franks.
Which is true.
And I think statistically, you almost did. I mean, Franks didn't do much to help them win that game.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing that Florida had an elite D, the under was the lean on that play as well. And then Burrow's late pick 6 was detrimental to that cause.
Yeah.
But two really good defenses. And honestly, both teams are still alive. I know it sounds crazy to say, but both teams are still alive for the playoff, even
Yeah.
Yep.
with just one loss and just hanging in the SEC and what they have in front of them.
Sure.
So both very much alive and very much interested to see how they rebound. Both teams going forward.
Florida is interesting now. All of a sudden, they're a top 10 team, I think, in the newest polls, right?
I think they're 14th now or something.
Oh,
like
okay.
that. In the AP, I mean, it's early enough.
But all of
to
a
where-
sudden, they jumped up there, and everyone forgot about them when they lost to Kentucky,
right?
And now they're back on the radar. So they'll definitely be a factor going forward in the SEC East.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how these teams go forward. Like we said, they're both still playoff contenders. Do we truly believe they are like legit playoff contenders? I think that's I don't know if we're on that train, but
Yeah.
So yeah, the next game, the second game that we previewed last week was the Red River Shootout. I am going to call it the Shootout because I don't care. That's what it's called. Texas and Oklahoma. And for the first time in a very, very long time, Texas got a big-time signature win. They almost blew it. And when I actually dug into this game, it's kind of – this isn't shocking to me, but when we previewed this game last week, we said the key that we felt was that Texas needed to possess the ball and to stay ahead of the sticks, essentially, and try to limit Oklahoma, the amount of plays that Oklahoma would run. That's almost exactly what happened. Texas ran, I think it was like maybe 20 more plays or something like that. Like Oklahoma averaged like 2.5 or 3 yards more per play. Like they had all those explosive plays.
Yeah.
But what surprised me about Texas was they, for the first time and the longest time that I can remember, they were winning the point of attack on the line. They were moving people, running the football.
That's what happens when you play Oklahoma sometimes.
Yeah, they're staying ahead of the sticks, and even though they almost blew it in the end, I think that's like one of those wins. It reminded me of when Penn State blocked those kicks against Ohio State. Like I felt like OSU outplayed them in that game, but it was like a signature win. And then all of a sudden, Penn State was covering all these games. They were beating ranked opponents, which they hadn't been doing in a long time. This could be a win that potentially springboards Texas back into national prominence.
Yep. Texas is just like Florida, and thinking about them, how they were kind of forgotten after they lost to Maryland. Bad start this season, but now all of a sudden they look like the Big 12 favorite. Of course, we could see a rematch of these two teams at the end of the season, which I think everyone would really like to see based on this game.
Oh, yeah.
What was crazy about that Oklahoma comeback is just how fast it happened. It was unbelievable. It took them
6 minutes to score 3 touchdowns.
6 minutes of game time to close a 21-point gap, and Texas didn't even turn it over either.
Yeah,
they were just dicing them.
Yeah,
and they were scoring I think they had a 5-play drive, a 3-play drive, and a 1-play drive. Yeah.
Yeah, Oklahoma was -3 in turnover margin. So as we saw with LSU Florida, clearly if you have some teams that are pretty even, if you lose the turnover battle, you usually lose the game.
Yeah.
Steele or Tolman, you guys got anything from that game?
Tolman?
David from New Orleans?
Yeah, sure. I felt like Ellinger is kind of a good fit, for Tom Herman's system as a quarterback. Kind of reminding me a little bit of, when Herman first had JT Barrett with all the called quarterback runs, in the power run game.
Yeah, it looked a lot like OSU from 14-15. It looked a little bit like Florida. The guys that were commentating the game, I think it was Gus and Joel Klatt. They were alluding to that too.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Gus Johnson factor definitely contributed to the comeback as well.
Clearly, yeah.
Games always get crazy when he's there.
Yeah. So I think I guess
Tom Herman again with the straight up win as a dog.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think what's his record as an underdog?
1, I think.
Yeah.
1.
Yeah, and he's got a ton of just straight up wins. So
straight up wins.
Yeah. My takeaway was are both these teams still playoff contenders? Is that what we think, or how do we feel about them right now?
Yeah.
Steele?
Oklahoma more so than Texas, which is funny because
See, I felt that way too.
Where
Yeah.
they just lost to them straight
Yeah,
out.
I feel like if Oklahoma played them like numerous times, Oklahoma would win the series. Like I think Oklahoma's a better football team,
Yeah.
but
And just going off of perception of preseason rankings, Oklahoma's in a far better spot than Texas.
Yeah.
Especially with Texas losing week 1. With the Big 12 championship game.
Maybe it was Texas I was thinking of that jumped into top 10.
Oh, yeah, they're 9th or something.
They're 9th.
Yeah. So,
I
go ahead, Tolan.
I think that Texas is more volatile. Like, they're more likely to lose to a West Virginia, TCU, Oklahoma State, or something like that.
Yeah.
And Oklahoma's less volatile, so I could see a scenario where Texas picks up a loss, Oklahoma and Texas still play each other in the Big 12 championship. Should be fun because that was a great game.
yeah. I think that's a good point. Like I don't have stats to back this up, but I think Herman kind of like with a target on his back, like being a favorite in a bigger game. I don't know if he's done as well, so that it will be interesting to see now. Texas all of a sudden now has the target on their back for the first time in a long time, and we're going to see how they react to that. We'll see how Oklahoma responds having the loss. And the thing is, now that we move into this, is a good segue into the third game that we previewed, which was Notre Dame Virginia Tech. Is that with Notre Dame being a favorite the rest of the way out, that's a big deal as far as these like one-loss teams go. That if Notre Dame goes 12-0, then these teams like Oklahoma and Texas, it's going to be tough for them if we are like under the assumption that the elite teams at the top that we consider like the teams that are playoff contenders right now, it's going to be detrimental to like Texas and Oklahoma. Now, like we said, there's no year where all these teams go 12-0, so like these teams still definitely have a shot, but it could be one of those things too where like the perception of the Big 12 hurts them. Like one-loss Florida winning would be, I would imagine them getting more love than like a one-loss Texas Big 12 champion. I'm not sure, but
yeah, they would.
Yeah, so let's segue into Steele and Corey from Denver's game. We don't have Corey on tonight. That makes sense.
He's hiding.
Yeah. Steele, if
He
you
has a job.
yeah, Steele, if you want to just kind of jump into it and your thoughts on the game and your path moving forward, I guess.
Yeah. So it was a good outcome.
Clearly.
Both teams played pretty shaky and kind of sloppy first half ball.
Yeah.
Notre Dame was trying to air it out all over the place, and Book was a little off. Notre Dame actually started the game with a perfect first opening drive. He was 7 for 7, and they marched down the field. But that's pretty routine for Notre Dame's openers. Their first drive is usually this year and last year ended with a lot of touchdowns. The script that Kelly comes up with is usually pretty good. But a lot of penalties and just a lot of miscues the rest of the way, at least in the first half. But I think Virginia Tech stubbed their toe more so than Notre Dame did.
Yeah.
Bud was working with a pretty hobbled unit on the defensive side of the ball, and they were already, a lesser unit than what they were accustomed to anyway. So it was just a matter of time before Notre Dame got into some spots where they could kind of pick them apart. Some key blocking on a 97-yard run for Dexter Williams, as I said, would be the X factor last week, and I think he was. Little tidbit for you, that was the most points that Virginia Tech had given up in a regulation game at Lane Stadium history.
Wow.
So, hashtag to you, Corey.
Nice.
I think it was a big step for Notre Dame to prove that they could go on a road in a hostile environment against a Power 5 team and essentially dominate their opponent, especially in the second half. So, as you alluded to, the second half of the schedule for them is pretty wide open. Obviously, I don't think they're a Bama caliber team where they could kind of just cruise the rest of the way, like the last 5 or 6 weeks or whatever it is.
Right.
So they're going to have to show up and actually play the games, and I don't think they're necessarily active buys, as we like to call them. They've got to show up and actually, play the game and win the game. But their outlook for the playoff is pretty bright now that they've gotten over their true road test against Virginia Tech. So it'll throw a wrench into things for sure, but I think everybody is in agreement if they win, they're in. To see who they play, that would be interesting, but that's about it, really.
Yeah, I mean, Virginia Tech clearly, from all like the suspensions and guys they lost in the offseason, and now you're starting to get some injuries. They just are depleted with their roster, and they're really young. I think the coaching staff's doing all they can do with these young kids, but they're just not a good football team this year. And I think Notre Dame went in and took care of business in an environment that people, I think, consider a tough place to play. So, I guess my takeaway was I felt like Notre Dame did what they needed to do. And that's all they got to do moving forward. But we'll see. We said last week, like Addison and I, when you and I and like Tolman were talking how, or I don't remember if Tolman was during this point of the pod, but we felt like maybe the only game that could possibly be tricky was like at USC, because we just felt like the other games. You said at Northwestern possibly. Like,
yeah, I've said they're going to lose.
Yeah. So I mean,
I have no reason to think that other than just because.
Like it's a turning of the calendar type of thing for Notre Dame failing late in the year apparently. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, my takeaway is Virginia Tech's depleted. They're not as good as people even like. There are people that thought they weren't that good anyway, and maybe they aren't even as good as that. I look for them to rebound next year and have a lot of experience coming back and should be a lot better off. But I think Notre Dame took care of business. That's about it really. Tolman, do you have anything you want to add from that game or?
No, I agree with you guys. Notre Dame took care of business. They keep taking care of business.
Okay.
They're definitely in the playoff.
Okay.
So yes, their outlook is very bright right now for the playoff.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to our winners and losers of the week. If you guys actually had that ready, I guess I'll go. My winner was Texas football. I mean, that's like the biggest win they've had in a very long time. I feel like it's a signature win, as people like to call it, and we'll see how they handle that moving forward. My loser, I actually had a harder time finding a loser this week. There was, I was thinking about going Florida State, but I think they've been used a few times. I went with Michigan State. I think there were some decent expectations for that program this year. And to lose to Northwestern for the third straight time, I think is kind of unacceptable. So I feel like they just, I don't know. We keep saying it. They can't run the ball. They can't stop the pass. They don't look that explosive anywhere on the field.
They have to get creative just to try and like generate rushing yards. Like, running Lewerke, like running option with him,
which is embarrassing.
Like running jet sweeps and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
They can't just give the ball to running back and just pound it.
Yeah, so I felt like all year long they were like a fringe top 25 team, and I think they're not maybe even quite that. So they're my loser for the week. Do you guys got winners and losers?
Well, Texas basically, whether they were the winner of the week or loser of the week, pretty much came down to that field goal at the end. Because if they had blown that game, they for sure would have been.
Yeah.
And that would have been a crippling loss, I think, for their program if they had
end the program.
Yeah.
If they would have lost.
If they had given up that lead in a game that they just seemed like they really needed.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Loser.
Loser. I don't know.
There weren't like a ton of like ridiculous.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I
could pick a player too.
I think I was thinking Florida State because they did choke away a 20-point lead in Miami.
Yeah. Rivalry game. Florida State was up a lot. They ended up blowing it again. So
yeah, they're not good.
Kind of feel pretty bad for Willie and his program. We've talked about them a lot on this pod. They're pretty bad. But Steele, you got winner or loser?
Loser, Arkansas.
Yeah,
just giving up 65 points to Bama, and they probably could have given up like 80,
100, yeah,
possibly more.
Yeah,
they're bad.
But they did have a backdoor cover, so kudos to them. With like 10 seconds left. Sorry, Corey. I know you.
So from a betting perspective, real quick, if you guys want to print money, bet Alabama to cover first half spreads, and then bet their opponent to cover the second half spread. And so far this year, you pretty much would hit it almost every time, I think.
Yeah, I think Bama's undefeated in first half spreads.
It's crazy. Yeah.
Have they gone over in every game except that Ole Miss game?
I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Winner. Tough slate to pick from for the winners.
Yeah.
Really not.
You could go with Dwayne Haskins. He had 6 touchdowns.
I mean,
I wanted to give him a shout out because he came up 3 yards short of the single game passing record for Ohio State.
Yeah.
Mississippi State. They could be a winner.
I guess.
Yeah.
Sure.
Beating an overrated Auburn team.
Mississippi State had a couple. They had a couple.
They're probably like 8th now, right?
Yeah, they had a couple disappointing weeks, and then they stifled Auburn. I think it's shocking to me that Auburn knew what Mississippi State was capped to on offense, and they still let Nick Fitzgerald run for 200 yards. I can't believe that.
Yeah, they did rack up a ton of rushing yards.
Yeah.
I was surprised by that.
Yeah. Tolman, do you have a winner or loser?
Sure, yeah. So my loser was real quick. BYU, their season's kind of over now. They just kind of have laid down the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Watched them a little bit on Friday. They just didn't have a whole lot. And,
Yeah, we were watching that too.
Had a splashy win against Wisconsin, and now they're relevant for the rest of the year.
Right.
Yeah, they're good for the year.
And my winner, this is a little abstract, but games when 2 teams that run like ball control style offenses play each other. You don't see that a whole lot these days. But I was just thinking about last night. I was flipping back and forth between outside of the Notre Dame game. I was flipping back and forth between the Mississippi State Auburn and the Kentucky Texas A&M. Two teams that love to control the ball, and it's just like a nice smooth game back and forth. Not as many stoppages. It was kind of fun to watch.
Okay, yeah. All right, so yeah, those were our winners and losers. We'll get into a good bet for each of us and a bad bet, as we always do, as I pull up our docs here. Addison, if you want to get into what one of your best bets and then your only losing bet, because you only bet 4 games this week.
Yeah. Let's see. Of the 3 that I won, had Florida State, Florida, and the Mississippi State under. Yeah, that's the best bet, I would say. I thought that both of those offenses were kind of one-dimensional, and they're going up against good D lines, and I just did not see a lot of points. So the under was I got a 43, ended up being a 23-9 final. So yeah, that game kind of went the way I thought it would. Right. Not necessarily who won.
Right.
Like, I'm not surprised Mississippi State won, but just that it was a very defensive game. And then my only loss, I didn't have a lot of games picked this week, but the Washington game was way closer than I thought it would be.
Same. Yep.
UCLA has been trash all year so far. Washington usually handles teams like that. I was thinking something like 42-7. What'd the final end up being? Like,
it was 24-17.
Yeah, that was the final.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the way UCLA had been playing this year, going up against Washington's D, I thought they were really going to struggle. And so
Yeah, UCLA actually moved the ball somewhat. Their success rate was pretty decent in the game. It was surprising. I don't know if Washington just didn't show up, if they had a bad week of practice, but I thought the same that you did. On last week's pod Sunday night, I said I bet that game before I even got on the pod.
I don't like laying 21 points either.
Right, I usually don't either. Yeah,
I did with that one.
Steele, I guess if you want to get into one each of yours, and then I'll give Corey's, and then mine, and Tolman can go after that.
They almost made my winner of the week, actually, but Cincinnati -7 against Tulane. They controlled the game
I
pretty
like
much.
that when I saw that, too.
Yeah, they controlled the game from start to finish and covered 7 pretty easily. I had Notre Dame -5, which they ran away with it in the second half. One of my bad ones was probably Syracuse -3. That was a stinky line, and I think we all recognized it. And I'm just more upset with the fact that Cuse got out to a 14-point lead and somehow just squandered it away, and then rallied, and then went to overtime, and then somehow still didn't cover the points. So it was just a stinky line, and like I said, we all kind of recognized it. Hughes had ample opportunities to actually cover the number and still didn't find a way to do it.
Sure.
It was
All right, so I'll give one each for Corey. I guess his worst bet would be Louisville plus 4.5 versus Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech.
Yeah.
They could have made losers.
Yeah.
Let's can we rewind?
we can
Let's
rewind.
rewind.
Wow, Louisville.
After we do this,
bad.
we rewind.
Yeah. Apparently, Paul Johnson hates Louisville's defensive coordinator Brian Van Gorder. He loves running it up on him because Steele mentioned this to us in the thread. So essentially, Brian Van Gorder for Louisville, he decided to play 2-3 techniques at like defensive tackle and then have standing linebackers over the A gaps.
Against a triple option.
If you know anything about triple option football, like that's going to be a give to the fullback every single play because those guys are going to get blown off the ball. The guards are going to essentially seal off the 3 technique. Like
They gave up 500 rushing yards.
that's all you need to know. Yeah. Georgia Tech won the game by I think 35 points or something like that. So Corey missed on that one.
We were kind of confused as to why Brian Van Gorder decided to
Yeah.
yield the center of the field
Yeah.
every play.
I guess Corey's best bet. He had a few good ones. I would say Iowa minus 6.5. They handled Minnesota in a very surprisingly high-scoring game.
That score was weird.
It was like 48-31 or something like that. But Iowa looked pretty solid. They handled a bad football team, and Corey felt like there was good value in that line, so he drilled it. As far as mine goes, I mean, I had Washington like Addison did. I guess one of my other losses was I'll say I got close on the cover, but Toledo minus 20.5 versus BG. As soon as I confirmed the bet, I felt like it was. In my mind, it was like BG is possibly the worst team in FBS this year, and the metrics they actually like Toledo to win the game by that much, but I don't think Toledo should be 3 touchdown favorites over any other MAC school. So I don't know. I just felt like that was not my best bet. But I had some dogs that won outright. Like Tolman alluded to, Utah State blasted BYU. I had them +3, so I guess that was a pretty good bet. Tolman, do you want to give a good bet and a bad bet from your slate?
Yeah, sure. Well, my worst bet was I took Stanford favorite at home.
Yeah.
And I could have maybe included them as my loser of the week, but I saw their season going downhill the last couple weeks.
Yeah.
Even though they won against Oregon and then against Notre Dame last week, and I still took them. And
Right.
Bryce Love didn't play, and they just looked lifeless. They didn't have a whole lot. So
whenever Love doesn't play the last couple of years, it's been they don't look good at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, my best bet. I actually felt like this was a real easy one, but I took the over 54.5 Oklahoma State, Iowa State. I just felt like 2 somewhat evenly matched Big 12 teams. That was an easy over and almost hit over, during the first half.
Yeah, that was way over. Yeah, it's a good bet. Okay, so some winners and losers as always. So let's get into the Week 7 preview now. I've got, it looks like 3 ranked versus ranked games. We've got Georgia at LSU. We've got Washington at Oregon, and then Wisconsin at Michigan. So we'll start with Georgia at LSU, and this is the first time, I think since Week 1 maybe, that we're actually previewing Georgia, a team that has just been sitting in the top 4 all year, and we just haven't had a chance to talk about them because they haven't played anybody since, well, I mean, I'm not going to say South Carolina somebody, but we felt like they could be at that point in the year. What's your first thoughts on Georgia LSU?
It'll be interesting to see how they handle that road environment. Like you said, we haven't really seen them in a big spot this year. LSU, right in the meat of their schedule, they're in the middle of a brutal stretch right now, just having played Florida. Now they got Georgia. The good thing about coming off a tough loss like that against Georgia for LSU is that sometimes it's good to have another big game coming up to refocus, I guess. And if they keep winning, I mean, they've got so many chances for good wins that the loss won't even matter.
Right. That game is at 3:30, so maybe not right away quite as like crazy as it would be as like a night game or nighttime kickoff, I guess. But the line is 7, I believe, right now. Georgia is favored by 7. Steele, if do you like first thoughts about that game? Which way would you lean if you had to lean right now?
Yeah, I think the line opened about 7.
Yeah,
and I wouldn't be surprised if it goes upward in favor of Georgia. I don't know. I don't think you're going to see much difference from 1 week with LSU's game plan, strategy, or performance.
You won't.
With
you won't see any difference in their game plan.
Yeah, with Georgia being obviously as good or much better than Florida, I would lean on the under. I would even lean to take Georgia to actually cover the number as well. I think everybody is pretty high on Georgia, and rightfully so. I just don't. I mean, if it was a night game, you might add a little bit more, credibility to LSU to be able to cover that number. But just from what I've seen, I just don't see. And Georgia's defense can be leaky at times, but does LSU have the playmakers or play calling to exploit it? And from what I've seen, I don't think they do enough. And I think Georgia would probably eventually cover the number. Close game in the first half, probably, especially first quarter. I don't think Georgia's going to jump on them right away, but I would lean Georgia in that spot.
So Georgia recently, they've actually been really good on the road, like covering spreads, and they've been like a solid road team in general. I mean, I think Steele and Addison nailed it pretty good. I think the key is like LSU I don't think they're efficient enough on offense or even explosive enough to keep up with Georgia. Georgia, their defense has been pretty inefficient. They're not. I believe when I last checked their metrics, they're not giving up a lot of big plays, but they are letting teams move the sticks on them. But I don't know if LSU is going to be able to do that quite enough. As Steele said, I think maybe LSU's crowd keeps them in the game at first. Maybe it's a little tighter, but I expect Georgia to make more plays on offense, and I would lean towards them to cover that number. Tolman, how do you see the game going, or what do you think?
I'm a Georgia lean right now just because I've watched all year LSU just go through these droughts scoring, and while their defense keeps them in games, I think Georgia's offense is going to put some points on the board. I actually think Georgia could jump out to an early lead and just kind of stabilize and hold. Just LSU doesn't have enough to come back. So I'd be a Georgia lean. It'll be interesting to find out. I think we'll get some more insight to who Georgia is this year. I've been really high on them, but they really haven't played anybody. So if they get some resistance, maybe we'll learn more about Georgia.
Yeah, for sure. Addison, did you have a lean on the number? I don't remember if you said or.
I didn't know what the spread was until you said it.
Okay. Yeah.
I would lean LSU.
Okay.
And I would wait to see if it goes up.
Yeah.
Before I were to take that, if I were.
Right.
Not saying for sure. I'm just saying that's the way I would lean. I think. Well, like in the last couple of years, it's definitely the toughest road game Georgia's played, or the toughest road environment. They did go to Auburn last year and get smoked. So
right.
Usually LSU at home getting like that many points, that doesn't happen very much unless the team is named Bama. So
which we might see later in the year. Yeah.
Yeah, that's just kind of how I feel about that.
Okay. Next game is going to be out west. Pretty big game in the Pac-12. Washington is at Oregon. I was surprised that this line opened. I think Washington was favored by either 4 or 4.5, and that's moved to, I believe, 3.5 now. When I first saw this line, I actually felt like it was a little bit off. I'm not so sure. I guess I'm going first. I'm not so sure that Washington is 6 points better than Oregon. I think when you have a quarterback that's like NFL caliber, like Herbert, I think that is going to do a lot for Oregon. I think Washington is efficient. I think they're very good on defense, but I'm not so sure that like they're that much like more elite than Oregon. I got to dip more into this game and see if that line matches up with the metrics. But from everything I've when I've dug into Oregon's, and like we said before, Oregon just started recently playing real football games this year. They played literally nobody like the first 3 or 4 games, but they were owning Stanford and just gave that game away. And then they had a very impressive win at Cal that I think was like a spot that a lot of people were on Cal, and Oregon showed up and they dominated. So this is a huge game in that division and in that conference. I think it's probably going to decide who comes out of that division.
Yeah.
I would lean Oregon in the points right now. Addison, if you want to go ahead with your first thoughts. And
Oregon coming off a bye too.
Yeah,
is that
yes,
correct?
yes,
That's another factor playing in here.
for sure.
So yeah, Oregon at Addison. It's 3 points.
It's 3.5 right now. Yeah.
3.5. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, you
I
don't
like
have
Washington,
to have,
but yeah,
you don't have to have a lean right
it's
now.
it's just kind of a toss up.
Yeah.
I'd probably take the home dog though.
Okay. Steele, thoughts about that game? The lean.
Yeah, same with Addison. Home dog in this situation off a bye. I think I've got a little bit more credit and feeling towards Oregon than I do Washington, just from what I've seen on the field. Essentially, an elimination game for the playoff, with both teams already having a loss.
Oh, for sure.
I like the time of the season when we start getting some elimination games,
Yeah.
too, like big ones like this.
Yeah, two losses from the Pac-12. You're pretty much out. Going to determine the Pac-12 winner. But I'd go Oregon at home with the points off a bye, and they might get the straight up win anyway. So.
Okay. Yeah. Tolman?
I like Washington to win the game on the field, though I think I'd probably lean Oregon on the spread. 2 reasons why I'm on Washington. I think they play the most physical. They have the most physical style of play in the Pac-12, and I think Oregon struggles with that.
Okay.
And I'm not taking Oregon to win big games until I see not a coaching change, but just their overall coaching situation improve, because I think that's hurt them in the past in big games.
Okay, yeah. That's a good point. I mean, when Oregon's played some physical teams before, they've definitely been dominated on the line and struggled against any kind of team that plays physical brand of football. And Washington does seem to play the most physical brand in the Pac-12. I mean, I think Stanford usually does, but Stanford is just
not this year.
They aren't the same Stanford. So Washington.
It's a big program game for Oregon, kind of like Texas's game last week. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So the last game that we will preview is going to be Wisconsin is going to Ann Arbor. I think it's going to be a pretty interesting game. That line is at 7. I think it opened at 8. I think Michigan's favored by 7 right now. I guess, Tolman, we can start with you, kind of go back the other way here. How do you feel about that game?
Well, playoff elimination game, I think.
Yeah.
I don't think either of those teams, regardless of if they make it to, if they win a Big Ten championship, can get in with 2 wins. I would lean Wisconsin just because I just think it's going to be a close game. Very, very similar. When I see 2 teams with similar styles of play, it'll be that both teams like the ball control offense kind of game that I like, which will be fun to watch. But I see low scoring, close game, and I would lean Wisconsin on the points, but Michigan pulls it out late at home.
Okay. I guess I'll go real quick just because I agree with that. I think Wisconsin this year. So, somebody that I know, they asked me the other day, Wisconsin, they're like, I feel like they're the same team, but what's different about them because they don't look as good? And I said, well, they did actually have a decent amount of turnover on defense. Their defense just hasn't been as efficient, and the offense kind of is what it's always been. So I think it's really just they're looking for some improvement from the defense. But they had a decently impressive win in Iowa. I mean, they could have lost that game, but it's a tough environment. A lot of people were on Iowa to win the game, like I know Addison and I were. So, I mean, it's going to be – what's interesting to me is it's going to be the first time since week 1 that we get another look at Michigan since they played Notre Dame. And, have they improved offensively since then? I want to see what their offensive line looks against Wisconsin. I would I think Michigan is going to win on the field, but I would not be surprised at all if Wisconsin wins the game, and I would definitely take Wisconsin on the points. And what I feel like is, I feel like these teams are a little bit more evenly matched than maybe like what Vegas thinks. So, Addison, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I agree with you guys. Initial thoughts are Wisconsin. I was trying to think of what I thought the line would be. I was thinking like maybe a touchdown, maybe like a shade under that or something. So if it's like at 8, then yeah, I'm definitely thinking Wisconsin, especially in a game that should be defensive and low scoring. Go with the points.
Yeah.
Under.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that all I need to say?
Yeah, that'll be an interesting one to see.
There should be a lot of punts, a lot of running, the only way you
of noodle arming the ball.
Yeah, I was going to say the only way you get burned on that is pick sixes. It's the only way I think that the over hits in this game.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think Vegas and like S&P, like they all have Michigan as like a top 6 team still. Like some metrics have them higher than Notre Dame.
Yeah, that's true.
Who they lost to.
That's a shame.
Yeah,
the committee doesn't look at that.
Right. So like, I think the point is like I think it's just like I said I'm just curious to see what Michigan looks like against another team that we consider like solid. Like I want to see what Michigan's going to bring to the table. Like this potentially might, like we talk about Harbaugh losing to like Sparty and Ohio State, but this is a pretty big win as far as like how the rest of the season might go. Like if Michigan loses this game, all of a sudden you've lost the 2 biggest games you play this year, and the Big Ten. Not only is your playoff hopes possibly dead, but your Big Ten title hopes are possibly crushed there too. So.
If they lose again, then then they could be looking at a situation where they could be like a 4-loss team again.
Yeah, right. So like this is kind of like, I don't know, I guess like that fork in the road type of saying for these guys. So I don't think usually we sometimes get into like week 7 leans for like other bets, but the lines are just coming out Sunday night. I haven't been able to look at anything. I don't think any of these guys have either. So do you guys?
I got an interesting one.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Northwestern is only favored by 6.5 against Nebraska at home.
So it's funny that you mentioned that.
That's intriguing.
It's funny that you mentioned that. When I did look for like a second, so here's the funny thing. I took Nebraska last week to cover 21 points in Madison, and they did. And there were a few times late in the game where I felt like they might not have, but for the second straight week, when Nebraska's had Adrian Martinez in the game, they've had almost as many yards as the other team, and they had more against Purdue. And yards per play, I think they actually had more yards per play than Wisconsin did in that game. So I have to dig into it, but what I'm guessing, because I haven't been able to watch a lot of these games that they've played, is that Nebraska is moving the football, but they must be like inefficient in the red zone, or like they seem undisciplined. I saw they had double the penalties and yards that Wisconsin did, and I've read that they've been quite undisciplined so far under Frost. So it's a team that is capable of moving the ball. You have Northwestern that just came off of a pretty big win. So that is one that I also will look at, Tolman. I think Nebraska they're not a good team, but as far as like the stats, the record and their stats don't match. I think they're better than what their winless record indicates.
Best 0-5 team in the country.
To be honest, I actually wouldn't be surprised if this would be their first win. I'm going to look hard at this game. I think it's definitely a spot where they could pick up their first win as an underdog. So that's funny that you mentioned that. That's a good one for sure. Are there any other closing thoughts or anything? Steele's obviously pumped about his massive victory over Corey's boys from Virginia Tech.
So big.
So yeah. All right. Well, yeah. I guess check back later in the week as usual for the bets that I'll put up for all of us, and I guess we will be back on next week.
I'll be there. I'll be visiting you guys.
Yep. Next.